Good evening. My name is Chris Morris, and this is my first radio show for Flipping the Pyramid. Over the coming weeks, I'm going to be discussing many issues that relate to the state of the world today and the direction the world's headed in. I don't know if any of you have previously heard me being interviewed by Keelan on his White It webcast show, but if you have, you might know that I'm also the author of a book which is called Hostile Takeover, the Anglo-American Establishment and the Emerging Global Corporate State, which very much gives my opinion and view on the nature of the society and culture that exists at present and the direction that it's likely to head in the future. So what I'm really going to be discussing on this programme over the coming weeks are issues related to this. I'd like to firstly thank everyone who's involved with running and setting up Flipping the Pyramid for asking me to be involved, which is very kind of them, and hopefully I can produce a programme that's informative and interesting to listen to. I wouldn't profess to be an accomplished radio host at this point in time, or even a competent one, but hopefully I will improve as the weeks go on. So if I forget to do anything that's considered to be customary, there's a reason for that. It's because I don't really know what I'm doing. But I thought I'd begin today by discussing, it seemed a logical place to begin by doing an introductory programme, just to explain the nature of how I see the world being today, the structure and the direction that, as I said, I see it going in the future. So in future programmes I'm going to discuss some of these issues, and perhaps also, I've got a few ideas about doing programmes on certain subjects, and I might do a bit of the two. I might do half a programme just discussing one subject in depth, and then half a programme going through some news issues. But I'm not going to discuss any news issues today. I'm just going to explain the world as I see it, explain the structure of the world, explain how the structure of the world contributes to outcomes that we see unfolding on a daily basis now in the news, in our daily lives even, and how this came into being. So I've really taken a post-Second World War focus on this particular matter. You can go back further than that, without a shadow of a doubt. There's the famous Carol Quigley book, Tragedy and Hope, that really charts the development of globalism over a period of centuries, and certainly something like the Rhodes Round Table Group and the expansion of the British Empire that was related to that, just British imperialism in general. Is a very important event that is strongly linked to what is taking place today, and this is written about quite extensively by Quigley amongst others, and it is a topic that I may discuss at some point, but generally I've taken a post-Second World War focus because there's for two basic reasons. Firstly, that it keeps things in a manageable and practical level that can be dealt with in some sort of vaguely acceptable length of time, and secondly, the reason is that in the immediate post-Second World War period, a number of things happen which directly and greatly contributed to the system that we see today, and really the conditions under which we live were a direct consequence of this. So that's why I take that focus, and I'd like to begin by discussing that immediate post-Second World War period now. So in 1944, you had the creation of the Bretton Woods system. This was the international condition of monetary management that was established. It always strikes me as quite odd and inappropriate, really, that this international system of monetary management was established during the Second World War. How you can establish such a system when there's a massive war going on that is just referred to as a world war that has consequences for the world as a whole, that's consequences for many of the people that are involved in the agreement. I have no idea. I'm sure you could sit here conspiracizing about why that was, as I have no evidence as to why it was. I wouldn't care to speculate, but I do think it's odd and somewhat inappropriate. But I just briefly read a little bit from Wikipedia about the Bretton Woods system, just in case people have not heard of it before. The Bretton Woods system of monetary management established the rules for commercial and financial relations among the world's major industrial states in the mid-20th century. The Bretton Woods system was the first example of a fully negotiated monetary order intended to give monetary relations among independent nation-states. Preparing to rebuild the international economic system as World War II was still raging, 730 delegates from all 44 Allied nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, United States, hence the reason it's called the Bretton Woods system, for the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. The delegates deliberated during the 1st to 22nd of July 1944 and signed the agreement on its final day. And what this essentially created was a system whereby gold was a reserve. It says here on 15th of August 1971, the United States unilaterally terminated the convertibility of the US dollar to gold. That was the end of the gold standard. The Bretton Woods system essentially created the gold standard and put it into place on a sort of global level. And as a result of what happened at Bretton Woods, the dollar became the world reserve currency. The pound had come off the gold standard, whereby the gold standard essentially means that the currency is securitized against a certain amount of gold. I haven't got the figures in front of me as to what amount of currency related to what amount of gold, but you can easily find this out. It's largely irrelevant now because Britain came off the gold standard in 1931 and the US came off the gold standard in 1971. And if you actually look at I mean, the pound has been tanking for decades, but I mean, if you look at a graph of the United States, the value of the dollar since they came off the gold standard is absolutely plummeted. That's because the currency isn't securitized against anything. It's securitized against securities, supposedly, but in reality, as soon as you just allow money printing, as soon as you allow people to have these trillion-dollar lines of credit, as soon as you allow the financial sector to expand to the extent to which it has now in Britain and America, you completely expand the monetary supply, and of course once you expand the monetary supply you devalue the monetary supply. So that's essentially why the value of the pound and the value of the dollar has completely plummeted since it came off the gold standard. I mean, there are arguments for and against it, and I wouldn't say that I'm completely sold on the idea that there should be a gold standard, but it would certainly be an improvement over what we have today. But the Bretton Woods system was not merely related to that, it's just one important element of it, but it was the conditions whereby, as it stated there, you've got dozens of allied nations taking part in this conference during the Second World War, and this was the conference whereby the conditions that were instigated in the international financial system over the next decades were really set in place. As I say, the dollar also became the world reserve currency really at around this time. What that means is that countries hold the dollar in their foreign exchanges, and it essentially creates very favourable conditions for the country that has the world reserve currency. When Britain was the sterling was the world reserve currency, Britain was the most powerful country in the world by a considerable distance. And as soon as the dollar, I mean, you could argue that the dollar became the reserve currency before the Bretton Woods Agreement, and you could argue that America was already the world's most powerful country before the Second World War, let alone after it. But certainly the Bretton Woods Agreement and the Second World War and the massive amounts of debt that the UK accumulated during this period all contributed to America becoming, I suppose, not an unchallenged superpower, because you could argue the Soviet Union challenged it, but it was certainly, the 20th century is often referred to as the American century, and this was really, as much as they'd had a very significant influence over the early half of the 20th century, this was really the point at which they became truly dominant. And I realised that lots of people believe, and understandably so, that it's not really the American century, it's not really America dominating things, and you'll find that the British financial system, the British banking system, is really bankrolling a lot of this activity, and the City of London remains incredibly influential and powerful. And I wouldn't disagree with any of that, and I'll get into talking about that in later programmes, but this, I'm really talking about things on a geopolitical level here, just talking about countries and military behaviour and so on and so forth. get into the people behind this and some of the forces behind this at a later date. So what you had at this time as well was the formation of several, I would say it's perfectly reasonable to describe them as globalists, but if you wanted to put the most positive spin on them possible, you could say they're transnational or multinational organisations. So firstly, you had the foundation of the United Nations in 1945. So I'll briefly read from Wikipedia. Obviously, I would assume that absolutely everyone listening to this programme is aware of what the United Nations is and has heard of the UN, but I'll just briefly read about it. The United Nations is an international organisation whose stated aims are facilitating cooperation in international law, international security, economic development, social progress, human rights, and achievement of world peace. I ask you. The UN was founded in 1945 after the Second World War to replace the League of Nations to stop wars between countries. Yeah, that worked. And to provide a platform for dialogue. It contains multiple subsidiary organisations to carry out its missions. There are 193 member states, including every internationally recognised sovereign state in the world but the Vatican City. Blah, blah, blah. There's a lot more stuff about the World Health Organisation, the World Food Programme, the United Nations Children's Fund, and other UN agencies. It's an incredibly influential political organisation. It's often asserted that a de facto world government will essentially evolve from the United Nations. I'm not sure about that. I'll come into discussing that in at some point, maybe today or maybe at a later date, I don't know. But I think that global government, in the practical sense, in terms of having an actual seat of government that is the world government and is referred to as the world government, obviously it's something that would benefit these globalist forces that have sought to put organisations like the United Nations in place. But I would argue that it's not really necessary because we're already being governed globally anyway. And actually the expression that you hear these people use and that you hear people on the political stage use quite frequently is global governance as opposed to global government. And the difference between the two is that if you have a global government, then it's quite clear that you have a global government because there is an official organisation that sits and takes place and everyone is aware of it. Much like, although people generally, for some bizarre reason, underestimate the influence of the United Nations and the European government and the European Union and so forth, we're well aware that these organisations exist. I mean, there's no real doubt about that. There's no doubt the European Central Bank exists. But I mean, people will underestimate its influence. But the system of global governance that has been in place for decades, most people don't even consider it. They don't consider the huge economic, social, and cultural impact that it's had and continues to have. That's what I mean. I would say that most people still believe that we live in a system of nation states and that most nations behave in their own interest, whether or not they behave in the interests of the people. Most people would still believe that governments act in their own interests or in the interests at least of their nation. Of course, this doesn't play out in reality at all. People would think that the US government was hugely nationalistic. I'm sure that's the kind of view that someone who works in the mainstream media, works for the BBC in particular, would put forward and would genuinely believe. I'm sure they would believe that Romney, for example, is hugely nationalistic. Whereas, of course, what he is someone who will serve the corporate sector and will serve multinational interests. But again, that's something that I'll get into later on. So, in addition to the foundation of the United Nations, you had the GATT agreement, it's the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. This later became the World Trade Organization. The GATT agreement, an organisation, was first formed in 1948. This is another very important thing because the expression that's often used is liberalised international trade. And sure enough, it says here on Wikipedia, the World Trade Organization is an organisation that intends to supervise and liberalise international trade. The organisation officially commenced on January the 1st, 1995 under the Marrakesh Agreement, replacing the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which commenced in 1948. the organisation deals with regulation of trade between participating countries. It provides a framework for negotiating and formalising trade agreements and a dispute resolution process aimed at enforcing participants' adherence to World Trade Organisation agreements, which are signed by representatives of member governments and ratified by their parliaments. So this very much extended the extent to which all of these member states, the kind of states that are involved in signing the United Nations agreements, and that were involved in the initial Bretton Woods Agreement, it very much extended the extent to which they trade with each other and began to break down what is often described as economic protectionism, which is just, the GATT agreement is referred to as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. What you had in place prior to the GATT agreement and what you've seen increasingly being broken down since are the sort of tariffs and protectionist measures that protect a country's individual businesses and companies from having a sort of preferential trading environment within their own country. So it just essentially means that products produced in a particular country are favoured over external products, over products that are imported into the country. So that just really essentially means that a country can retain control of its own industry and can at least maintain a significant percentage of its products being produced within its own borders. As soon as you break those measures down, then you have a situation where it's survival of the fittest, and whoever is the most successful at selling things at the cheapest price possible and producing them at the cheapest price possible will win sooner or later. And I'll get onto the effects of that later on. But this is something that will be quite evident in everyday life. People, again, it's something that people generally discount, it's something that people generally don't pay attention to, it's something that people possibly, even if they do notice it, think that it came about due to organic factors, which it in fact didn't. It came about very much due to the environment that was created by all the things that I'm going to be discussing today. Also, around this time, just after the formation of the United Nations and World Trade Organisation, was the formation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation. Again, this is something that is viewed as an organisation that will eventually evolve into a world army. Whether or not that is the case, there's already strong indication that they serve this role. If you look at what NATO has been up to, and there are other sort of lesser known, obviously NATO has been involved in Iraq, it's been involved in Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. Hasn't been directly involved in Syrian military action as of yet, but they've been involved to a certain extent. And you can guarantee, as and when, or if and when, if you want to put a slightly more positive spin on it, the United States and Israel decide that Iran is to be targeted, you can guarantee that NATO will get involved there. So this, just briefly read about NATO here. The North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, or NATO, Organisation de Traité de l'Atlantique Nord, not very good at reading French, also called the North Atlantic Alliance, is an intergovernmental military alliance based on the North Atlantic Treaty, which was signed on the 4th of April 1949. The organisation constitutes a system of collective defence. It's a very key phrase there, collective defence, whereby its member states agree to mutual defence in response to an attack by an external party. That's an interesting assessment of what happens. The member states agree to mutual defence in response to an attack by an external party. That's not really my recollection of what happened with NATO recently. What was it called in Iraq? Operation Enduring Freedom. I'd hardly describe Operation Enduring Freedom as member states agreeing to a mutual defence in response to an attack by an external party, but there you go. NATO's headquarters are in Brussels, Belgium, one of the 28 member states across North America and Europe, the newest of which, Albania and Croatia, joined in April 2009. An additional 22 countries participate in NATO's Partnership for Peace. I mean, you only have to read the first paragraph of these things to just see how completely laughable they are, but anyway. With 15 other countries involved in institutionalised dialogue programmes, the combined military spending of all NATO members constitutes over 70% of the world's defence spending. Just even the word defence is completely euphemistic. NATO's taken a completely aggressive role, in actual fact. But, so, within 4 years after the Second World War, massive international conflict has taken place. Millions of people, tens of millions of people lose their lives. Has absolutely phenomenal consequences. I'm sitting here in a country in which it probably had the greatest consequences of all, but it certainly had far-reaching consequences beyond Britain and Germany and Japan and the major players in the war. It had huge consequences, and of course it was fought for peace. Ostensibly it was fought to prevent fascism, it was fought to prevent the Nazi takeover of Europe and ultimately the world. That's very much how it was sold to the people. Yeah, the concept of anything like these intergovernmental and multinational agreements at the time to the people would have been repulsive. This is why it all happened very quietly at a time when people were far more concerned about the conditions in which they were living. For example, in Britain, you had the situation where rationing actually took place until 1954. So this is pretty unimaginable, I think, to people now. But for 10 years after the Second World War, people obviously couldn't just go into a shop and buy whatever they wanted to eat. They were allocated a certain amount of stuff that they could purchase during a week, and they had to amend and make do with what they had. So under these conditions, they probably weren't that concerned about the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation. They had more immediate fish to fry. So I really do believe that was quite a deliberate thing to take advantage of the prevailing conditions and to usher these things into existence very quickly. And I'm sure there were people that were involved in it that were genuinely well-meaning and thought, well, we've had a lot of conflict, we've had a massive world war, we can't be having any more of that, we need to have these binding agreements put in place to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. But unfortunately, it has been completely exploited to move the world order in a direction which is not particularly healthy. So already by this time, in the few years that immediately follow the Second World War, you have these numerous globalist or transnational organisations being set up. All of them remain influential today. Obviously the GATT agreement has become the World Trade Organisation, but the position of the United Nations, the position of the World Trade Organisation, the position of NATO, if anything, they've become more powerful, if anything, they've become more influential. And of course you have this global system of monetary management as well. And these organisations are run by an Anglo-American political consensus, with the US ostensibly taking the lead role. Also at this time you had the formation of Israel in 1947, which you could now suggest, particularly after the Six-Day War in 1967, that really the world is run by an Anglo-American Israeli political consensus. Israel formed following the adoption of a resolution by the United Nations General Assembly on the 29th of November 1947, recommending the adoption and implementation of the United Nations Partition Plan of Mandatory Palestine. On the 14th of May 1948, David Ben-Gurion, the executive head of the World Zionist Organization and president of the Jewish Agency for Palestine, declared the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel to be known as the State of Israel, a state independent upon the termination of the British mandate for Palestine. I'll be getting into discussing Israel and Palestine at a later date. I'm definitely going to do a program on that because it's one of the world's great. I really don't know how to describe it. I mean, it's just a staggeringly disgusting. It's an outrage, really, what has occurred there and what continues to occur there. And what is not what is the most outrageous thing about it is not merely what is happening on the ground on a daily basis and what's happened historically, both of which are terrible things, but it's more the fact that there's a tacit acceptance of what is taking place in the West and in the Western media, and in fact Palestine are almost without exception painted as being the bad guys, and Israel are almost without exception painted as being in the right and democratic and a good country and so on and so forth, and just concerned about their own quote-unquote security, which is a staggeringly it's a complete corruption of what is actually taking place, and it's staggeringly inaccurate. So I will be discussing that at some point in the future. Of course, no one is more guilty of this than the BBC. the BBC's take on the Israel-Palestine conflict shouldn't even be called a conflict because it's more of a slaughter than a conflict. But their take on the Israel-Palestine conflict is absolutely diabolical and ridiculous. And it's so systematic, the people involved will obviously know that they're just lying and putting propaganda out there. It's not merely the fact that they're producing misleading material that the people involved are too naive or stupid to think that to understand that it's inaccurate. It's quite deliberate propaganda to really A, buttress people's belief and faith in Israel, and B, completely obfuscate issues and confuse people. And they do a very good job of obfuscating issues and confusing people, because if you went to speak to the average person in the street about Israel and Palestine, I guarantee you they will have no idea what's going on. And it could really be explained to them in quite simple terms by the news every single evening, or certainly every time they report on Israel, but it never is. It's always placed in this ridiculous context and this absolutely farcical language that completely shrouds what is really happening in this soup of just total nonsense. So I will be discussing that at a later date. In addition to these globalist organisations that are created, you also have the beginning, well, already in place was the beginning of what is, that I describe as an elite policy network. And this is a series of clandestine and less clandestine organisations that are used as essentially talking shops and meeting groups for a surfeit of elite people that they either occupy high-ranking political positions or high positions in business and commerce or banking positions, occasionally military, but I mean the military are really there to do as they're told, not really to have an input into what's going on. So you firstly have the creation of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, or Chatham House, in 1920. So I'll just read a little bit about Chatham House. Again, the Wikipedia page for Chatham House is frankly farcical. Chatham House, also known as the Royal Institute of International Affairs, is a non-profit, non-governmental organisation based in London whose mission is to analyse and promote the understanding of major international issues and current affairs. It's really to promote the misunderstanding of those things. It is regarded as one of the world's leading organisations in this area and is the originator of the world-famous Chatham House Rule. I'll discuss that in a second. It takes its name from its premises, a Grade 1 listed 18th century house in St James's Square. Chatham House was ranked as the number 2 think tank in the world and the number 1 non-US think tank by the University of Pennsylvania's 2011 Global Go-To Think Tanks rating. I'm assuming that they rated the Council of Foreign Relations as the number 1, but I don't have that list in front of me. Chatham House was also named the top non-US think tank by Foreign Policy magazine, which listed it as one of the top scholars for being among a handful of stars of the think tank world, who are regularly relied upon to set agendas and craft new initiatives. The Foreign Policy magazine, I think, is a Council of Foreign Relations publication, if I remember rightly. So, you have the Council on Foreign Relations praising Chatham House. The Council of Foreign Relations is the US branch of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and it was formed in 1921. So for them to be praising the Royal Institute of International Affairs is hardly surprising. There's actually a little bit about foreign policy here that I'll just read out. Foreign policy's contributors include former US diplomat Peter Galbraith, Pulitzer Prize-winning military reporter Tom Ricks, international bestseller Stephen Waite, blogger Daniel W. Dresner, former Los Angeles Times columnist Rosa Brooks, Christian Brose, Condoleezza Rice's longtime chief speechwriter, 9/11 Commission Director Philip Zelikow, ex-senior White House aide Peter Feaver, top Pentagon officials Dov Zakheim, he was one of the PNAC signees, I think, John McCain's foreign policy advisor Steve Began, and Josh Rogin, a Washington journalist specialising in investigative reports on national security and foreign affairs. Whenever they say national security, it just means bombing other countries. That's just a euphemism for bombing poor countries all over the world. Council on Foreign Relations was derived from the Royal Institute of International Affairs and remains the US arm of the Royal Institute of International Affairs. I assume in these two lists that I just mentioned that it's regarded as the number 1 think tank in the world. It says briefly on Wikipedia, the Council on Foreign Relations is an American non-profit, non-partisan membership organisation, publisher and think tank specialising in US foreign policy and international affairs. Founded in 1921 and headquartered at 58 East 68th Street in New York City, with an additional office in Washington DC, the CFR is considered to be the nation's most influential foreign policy think tank. It publishes a bi-monthly journal, Foreign Affairs. So, both of these organisations become incredibly influential as the century develops. The Chatham House rules that I just mentioned later apply to the next institution I'm going to discuss, which is the Bilderberg Group, because the Chatham House rules indicate that even when you're having a discussion, if you're having a discussion within an organisation and you're taking minutes of the meeting, that everyone should remain anonymous. It's really a way of protecting people from ever being held to account in the future. So everyone, I'm assuming, that's listening to this has heard of the Bilderberg Group. Their first meeting was in 1954, named after the Hotel de Bilderberg, where the first meeting took place. I'm going to have a break at this point because I'm going to discuss the Bilderberg second meeting in 1955 in more depth. The Bilderberg Group, along with the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House and the Trilateral Commission, formed the more clandestine part of this, what I call the elite policy network. And I want to discuss the 1955 meeting in more depth because some very significant things occurred and were discussed during that meeting, which become relevant in the later political period. So I'll just take a pause at this point and have a drink of water, and you can listen to a tune. Okay, so we've now reached, just to remind you, the formation of the Bilderberg Group in 1954. I think it's just briefly worthwhile to look at the social and political context that was taking place at that time. We think that Bilderberg is a secretive organisation now, but of course in 1954 there was the amount of media that existed compared to today was absolutely trivial. I mean, there was as far as I'm aware, there was one television channel in Britain at that time. I think this was before the formation of ITV. I don't think BBC Two came back to the 60s, as far as I recall. So I think it's just BBC One. So you can imagine they probably didn't report on the formation of the Bilderberg Group on BBC in 1954. So this is a very the things that were taking place were very much in the background, and of course very few people would have known of the existence of, I imagine none of the general public knew of the existence of Chatham House and the Council of Foreign Relations. And the Bilderberg Group, I would very much bracket with these groups because you see the same people being involved in them. And that would also apply to trilateral commissions, and it will also apply to the more transparent, slightly more transparent and slightly more open and slightly more in the public consciousness organisations, which I will get on to discussing after I discuss Bilderberg. So, a particularly important Bilderberg meeting, I've discussed this previously on Flipping the Pyramid, was 1955. There could have been some very important things discussed in the 1954 Bilderberg meeting, but as we don't have any evidence of what was discussed there, it's very difficult to say. But we do have minutes from the 1955 Bilderberg meeting, which were released by WikiLeaks. And firstly, there's in general terms, the thing to note is that a lot of things were discussed that either weren't part of the political agenda at that time and became part of the political agenda in the following years, or weren't part of the political agenda for decades into the future. But it shows the extent to which the political class and the business class already had a very clear idea of which direction they wanted the world to move, even at this time. So if you go, you can look up the 1955 Bilderberg minutes yourself online. It's an exceptionally obtuse document to read, but there's a great deal of material about the reunification of Germany and the breakup of the Soviet Union. Of course, the reunification of Germany didn't happen for about 35 years after the 1955 Bilderberg meeting, and when the Berlin Wall came down. And the breakup of the Soviet Union happened about the same time. So yeah, this is an incredible amount of foresight that's being displayed here. This would have not have been in any way part of the mainstream political discussion, and it was not something that even came close to occurring for several decades later. But it was obviously something that was desired, and if you actually read the document, you can see the reasons why they desired it. And it was all really to do with trading. It was all just so they could open up another market. And that's one of the primary reasons that all these things are taking place, just to create one global marketplace for all of this crony capitalist fiefdom to exploit, essentially. So many other important things were discussed at Bilderberg in 1955 that didn't appear in the political agenda for several decades afterwards. The first one of these is a quotation that I'll quote straight out of the minutes, which says, "A European speaker expressed concern about the need to achieve a common currency and indicated that in his view this necessarily implied the creation of a central political authority." Now, this creation of central political authority happened very shortly afterwards, when the European Parliament was effectively created by the Treaty of Rome, signed on the 25th of March 1957, came into force 1st of January 1958. Obviously, the Bilderberg promotion of this predates this event, but the creation of the single European currency, the euro, was not officially decided until the signing of the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. Yet it was being discussed 37 years previously to this, and it was something that they really wanted to happen, something that they desired to take place, and eventually they got there. And of course, what is the single European currency? What does it represent, and what are the implications of it? It's an implication of unity and consensus, and it's created these unified conditions across Europe, and that is very much it's the theme that's writ large across all of these things: is unification, centralisation, the ironing out of any differences, the consensus, and that's all heading towards this globalised society, this transnational society, everything being governed on a multinational basis, not by national parliaments or, heaven forbid, actually regional organisation and governance. So this Bilderberg has probably been the foremost organisation that's pushed for this kind of globalism, because and as well, this is an important point to make as well. Bilderberg very much reflects this Anglo-American dominance that I discussed previously, because even today, even when it's acknowledged that there are many other significant forces in the world on a nation-state basis and on a regional basis than Europe and America, North America, you don't see any of these people being invited to Bilderberg. You don't see any Chinese people being invited. You don't see any people from the Eastern Bloc behind what used to be described as behind the Iron Curtain. You don't see any of these nations being invited. It is just the Anglo-American, EU-NATO, Western system that has been dominant. And Bilderberg is very much a talking shop for these people. And I'm sure that if we had decades of minutes, that we would be able to see very carefully how this consensus has been crafted over decades. Is we can only briefly dip into it and see some of the things that have been discussed, but it gives you an indication of what was desired even at the earliest meetings of Bilderberg. So another thing they discussed, I just want to read out briefly, was it was generally recognised that it is our common responsibility to arrive in the shortest possible time at the highest degree of integration, beginning with the European market. It was also generally agreed that the tariff wall surrounding this common market should certainly not be higher and should possibly be lower than the average of the existing tariffs now applied by the individual countries concerned. So that was reflects back to what I was saying previously, where this is about the removal of economic protectionism. It's about creating a very fertile environment for multinational corporations and for multinational banking institutions, which is, of course, exactly what's followed. So you already have them openly discussing the deregulation of markets, which followed extensively throughout the 1960s and 70s, which led directly to the phenomenon of globalisation, which groups such as Bilderberg today use for the justification for meeting. and they explicitly state this policy in the minutes. Quote, in the light of the existing prosperity, it would be a serious mistake not to do everything possible to further the removal of restrictions on the free flow of goods and capital. So, of course, this isn't to benefit the people. You know, the free flow of goods and capital, they make it sound like, oh, it's just to get more stuff into the country so that people got more stuff to buy. Obviously not to benefit the average person, because people, as I say, were still living under conditions of rationing at that time in Britain. It's very much to benefit this sort of crony capitalist industrialist that wished to dominate this trading area that was eventually set up, and that they're talking about setting up at this time. So I will go on to discussing the consequences of this later in this programme. It has had a huge impact on the way that we live our lives, and has had a huge impact on the landscape and geography of the country as a whole, and of Europe as a whole. So one of the most important Bilderberg attendees, certainly from a British perspective, is Edward Heath, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain in the 1960s and 1970s. He's a particularly important Bilderberg attendee because he perhaps did more than any other British Prime Minister to contribute to the federalised European state that exists today. On the 22nd of January 1972, he's made a speech in Brussels, Belgium, which was later the seat of the European Parliament, in which he heavily promoted the concept of closer ties between European countries. And I'll just quote briefly from that speech. Just as the achievement we celebrate today was not preordained, so there will be nothing inevitable about the next stages in the construction of Europe. As the enlargement of the community makes clear beyond doubt, we have all come to recognise our common European heritage, our mutual interests and our European destiny. Imagination will be required to develop institutions which respect the traditions and individuality of the member states, but at the same time have the strength to guide the future course of the enlarged community. The European communities, far from creating barriers, have served to extend east-west trade and other exchanges. So, excuse me, Heath later went to great lengths to promote Britain's ascension into the European Economic Community, or Common Market as it is often referred to, which was generally opposed by the general public and was particularly opposed in the immediate post-Second World War period, where millions of people had given their lives to prevent exactly this kind of unification. Of course, you know, people would argue that the EU and the Eurozone and the European Common Market are not as fascistic as what the Nazis had in mind, and you know, this is a reasonable argument, but it's certainly considerably less quote-unquote democratic than you might hope for. And it certainly would not have been what the general public would have wanted to happen in the immediate post-Second World War period. So, of course, it had to be, particularly in Britain, it had to be worked towards over a period of time. Most of Europe proceeded to the Common Market in 1957. But Heath denied or was very evasive when asked about Bilderberg, but we know for a fact he attended in 1963, 64 and 67. I think it's in the United States Congressional Report or something like that. But anyway, we know for a fact that he attended. And in his the first meeting he attended in 1963, I'll just quote a few things which discuss Britain's entry into the common market. 3 items were included on the agenda: trade relations between the United States and Europe in the light of the negotiations for Britain's entry into the common market. While all the European speakers discussing the failure of the Brussels negotiations recognised its harmful consequences for the Atlantic Alliance, there were some who showed themselves anxious to reduce the question to narrower proportions. I apologise for the nature of the way this is discussed. Obviously it could be made more clear. A French speaker, for instance, considered that 2 problems had been confused: an economic problem arising at the Atlantic level, and which should not therefore be presented in terms of Great Britain's adherence to the common market. As requested by the chairman, certain participants from the 2 countries concerned discussed the recent Franco-German treaty. According to a German speaker, that treaty represented the final unfortunate conclusion of a long period of hostility. As such, it should be welcomed by all members of NATO, all the more so since it could exercise a stabilising influence when certain divisions, such as those concerning Great Britain's entry in the common market, had been overcome. Notice it's not if Britain joins the common market, it's when it happens. I mean, this it's incredibly euphemistically discussed there, and obviously the language is quite impenetrable. But to just sum it up briefly, this discussion predates Britain's eventual entry into the common market, more correctly referred to as the European Economic Community, by a decade. There's a BBC article discussing Edward Heath, and they helpfully note that Britain's entry into the European Economic Community on the 1st of January 1973 was Heath's greatest achievement. But this is absolutely a classic example of Bilderberg discussing something a long time before it enters the political agenda. It's something the public would have been opposed to, of course. And again, the common market has paved the way for the Eurozone that exists today, the Euro-fascist state as it could be described. And the common market is, and this is greatly opposed by people on both sides of the political spectrum. If you go and ask Tony Benn of the Labour Party for his view on the subject, he will tell you the common market is a disaster. The people on the right of the political divide, on the Tory side, they're typically described as Eurosceptic, as jingoistic, as being against Europe. So all the right-thinking people on both sides of the British political debate were against this, but it still happened, of course, because it benefited the surfeit of corporate interest that managed to take control of the culture, essentially. So you have the formation of the common market in 1957, eventually Britain seizes the common market in 1973. This is the formal creation of the Eurozone that exists today. Well, while this is taking place, there have been decades of GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, discussions taking place all over the world, but the United States has taken a major lead in them. For example, you can look up the Kennedy round of the GATT discussions, named after John F. Kennedy, who died 6 months before these negotiations. Just briefly read from Wikipedia regarding these. The Kennedy round was the sixth session of General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade negotiations held in 1964 to 67 in Geneva, Switzerland. Congressional passage of the US Trade Expansion Act in 1962 authorised the White House to conduct mutual tariff negotiations, ultimately leading to the Kennedy round. Participation greatly increased over previous rounds. 66 nations representing 80% of world trade attended the official opening on May 4th, 1964. The Director General announced the round's success on May 15th, 1967, despite bitter disagreement upon many of the details. The final agreement was signed on June 30th, 1967, the very last day permitted under the Trade Expansion Act. The round was named after President John F. Kennedy. The main objectives of the Kennedy round were to slash tariffs by half of the minimum of exceptions, to break down farm trade restrictions, to strip away non-tariff regulations, to aid developing nations. That's obviously going to turn out to be a load of rubbish. But this is what I was saying previously. All these negotiations are taking place, and these have been taking place for decades and decades of these discussions. Decades in Europe, and the United States has been leading these GATT negotiations that have included countries that represent 80% of world trade, and all they're doing is stripping away all the regulations that stop crony capitalism, stripping away all the regulations that stop multinational corporations going into every country in the world and completely dominating them. And this has been happening systematically for decades. And if you go back and look at the very first Bilderberg meeting minutes that we have available, it's just a second meeting of Bilderberg. This is the theme of the entire meeting. It's just, what can we do to increase trade? What can we do to liberalise trade? What can we do to protect nationalist protectionism? To eradicate national protectionism? What can we do to strip away tariffs in trade? And this is just one element of this, what I call the elite policy network. So you have Chatham House and Council on Foreign Relations saying very much the same thing. So we're now in the early 1970s. The final touches to the European common market are being put in place. You also have the creation of the organisations that are openly global in their outlook and scope. And I'm not going to discuss these in chronological order because I want to discuss the Trilateral Commission before I discuss the other organisations that we tend to see. The BBC will at least make the odd mention of them. It doesn't explain how important they are, it doesn't explain why they're not justified, it doesn't explain how it goes against the principles that are held up every day on the international stages as being important. But they will at least say the G8 exists, for example. So obviously I'll get into discussing the G8 in a second. But the Trilateral Commission is... They're more open than Bilderberg. You know, they're open about who is a member, but they're not particularly open about what the real aims are. or they have a certain clandestine element, but they're often bracketed with Bilderberg Council on Foreign Relations because you see a very clear link between the three in terms of membership, in terms of the people who participate, and in terms of their aims. I'll just briefly read about the Trilateral Commission from Wikipedia. The Trilateral Commission is a non-governmental, non-partisan discussion group founded by David Rockefeller. Obviously very significant. Rockefeller, a key Bilderberg attendee, involved in the steering committee of Bilderberg, and has been very much a globalist, had very much a globalist outlook for many decades. Rockefeller Foundation and so on and so forth. And it says the aim of the Trilateral Commission is to foster closer cooperation between the United States, Europe and Japan. And again, if you look at just a brief discussion of the history of the Trilateral Commission, I'll just quote from Wikipedia. Growing interdependence is a fact of life of the contemporary world. It transcends and influences national systems. While it's important to develop greater cooperation among all the countries of the world, Japan, Western Europe and North America, in view of their great weight in the world economy and their massive relations with one another, bear a special responsibility for developing effective cooperation both in their own interests and in those of the rest of the world. To be effective in meeting common problems, Japan, Western Europe and North America will have to consult and cooperate more closely on the basis of equality to develop and carry out coordinated policies on matters affecting their common interests, refrain from unilateral actions incompatible with their independence and from actions detrimental to other regions, and take advantage of existing international and regional organisations and further enhance their role. The Commission hopes to play a creative role as a channel of free exchange of opinions with other countries and regions. Further progress of the developing countries and great improvement of East-West relations will be a major concern. And Brzezinski was a founding member. Zbigniew Brzezinski is a major influence over American politics. If you look at the books he's written, like The Grand Chessboard, they very much predicted the system that is the political system and direction of the political system that has emerged over the previous decades. Some of his other books are incredibly foresighted in terms of discussing and predicting various technological changes that have taken place. There were other founding members of the Trilateral Commission, included Alan Greenspan and Paul Volcker, both later heads of the Federal Reserve System. There are other important people that were involved as well. But this is very, very much a globalist institution. And although they are open about their existence and they would try and pretend that they're transparent, their real aims are to forward this globalism that has been the focus of all these organisations I've discussed already. Now, although the Trilateral Commission is somewhat clandestine along with the Council on Foreign Relations, I suppose you could argue the Council on Foreign Relations is a bit more transparent because you tend to get CFR members appearing on the news and such like. Along with the Trilateral Commission and Bilderberg, they are nevertheless fairly, could describe it as underhand about what their real intentions are and why they exist. But there are other organisations that were created around this time in the early to mid 1970s that we see mentioned regularly on the television news. These would be considered relatively open organisations, although their influence is often underestimated on a daily basis when current affairs are being discussed. The first of these I wanted to discuss is the World Economic Forum. I'm just going to briefly discuss a bit of background related to that. The World Economic Forum was founded in 1971 by Klaus Schwab, a German-born business professor at the University of Geneva. Originally named the European Management Forum, it changed its name to the World Economic Forum in 1987 and sought to broaden its vision further to include providing a platform for resolving international conflicts. In the summer of 1971, Schwab invited 444 executives from Western European firms to the first European Management Symposium held in the Davos Congress Centre under the patronage of the European Commission and European Industrial Associations, where Schwab sought to introduce European firms to American management practices. Schwab developed a stakeholder management approach which attributed corporate success on managers taking account of all interests, not merely shareholders, clients and customers, but also employees and the communities within which the firm is situated, including governments. Events in 1973, including the collapse of the Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate mechanism and the Arab-Israeli War, saw the annual meeting expand its focus from management to economic and social issues, and political leaders were invited for the first time to the annual meeting in January 1974. And then there's various discussion of some of the political issues that have been discussed at the meeting and some of the people that attended. It's a very significant organisation as well, and you'll often hear on the when it comes around to the World Economic Forum meeting, you'll often hear the name of Davos particularly being mentioned if you watch the BBC. The second organisation I briefly wanted to discuss was the G8 group, or the Group of Eight. I will just briefly mention what it says on Wikipedia about this group. The Group of Eight is a forum for the government of 8 of the world's largest economies. It excludes, however, 2 of the actual 8 largest economies by nominal GDP, China and Brazil. That's very significant, the fact that it excludes China and Brazil. I probably won't be coming to that today, probably going to discuss that next week. But if this is, there's no coincidence that China and Brazil have been excluded. The forum originated with a 1975 summit hosted by France that brought together representatives of 6 governments: France, Germany, Italy, Japan and the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom and the United States, thus leading to the name of the Group of 6 or G6. The summit became known as the Group of 7 or G7 the following year with the addition of Canada. In 1997, Russia was added to the group, which then became known as the G8. The European Union is represented within the G8 but cannot host or chair summits. And this is another... You will have seen, I think famously there was a G8 meeting taking place when 7/7 happened, and they all came. You saw the leaders of the countries come out and make a statement about how terrible 7/7 was, and so on and so forth. But this is another talking shop for these very influential European and North American nations, and there's Japan and Russia there as well. But it's very much the Anglo-American. EU-NATO led world, and also represented as well are the European Union with Van Rompuy and Jose Manuel Barroso. I've mentioned Barroso in previous interviews. He's a very significant person. Van Rompuy he's constantly being berated by Nigel Farage of UKIP for being pretty despicable. But he's the Council President of the European Union, and Barroso is the Commission President of the European Union. So this is another very significant group that once again looks to come to a consensus, they would describe it as, on global issues amongst these powerful countries and influential countries. And I could just mention the G20 group at this point as well, but arguably less significant than the G8 group. But this is the group of 20 finance ministers and central bank governors from 20 major economies, 19 countries plus the European Union, which is represented by the President of the European Council and the European Central Bank. The G20 heads of government or heads of state have also periodically conferred at summits since their initial meeting in 2008. Collectively, the G20 economies account for more than 80% of the gross world product and 80% of world trade and 2/3 of the world population. The G20 was proposed by former Canadian Prime Minister Paul Martin as a forum for cooperation and consultation on matters pertaining to the international financial system. The group was formally inaugurated in September 1999 and held its first meeting in December 1999. It studies, reviews and promotes high-level discussion of policy issues pertaining to the promotion of international financial stability. Not doing a very good job, are you? And seeks to address issues that go beyond the responsibilities of any one organisation. With the G20 growing in stature after the 2008 Washington Summit, its leaders announced on September the 25th, 2009 that the group would replace the G8 as the main economic council of wealthy nations. So this is really a replacement for the G8 group, but to be fair, by the time this group has been put together and inaugurated in 2008, the system that it's overseeing and discussing is already very much in place. So in terms of the creation of that system, it's not as significant. But obviously, the description that I've just given shows you how important it is today. But again, this group has devolved from other existing groups. So the G20 group was devolved from the G33 group. The group of 33 was an international grouping that existed briefly in 1999, comprising the 33 leading national economies of the world. That was derived from the group of 22, which was announced by the leaders of OPEC in 1997. The initiative was to convene a number of meetings between finance ministers and central bank governors to make proposals on reform of the global financial system. So that's derived from the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. This was a forum for 21 Pacific Rim countries, formerly member economies, that seek to promote free trade and economic cooperation throughout the Asia-Pacific region. So you can see just from that this is the extent to which all these things have been going on in the background that most people don't know about. If you ask most people, what are the group of 33? What's the group of 22? What's the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation group? What's the Pacific Rim even? They really would have no idea. And yet all these meetings and all these groups have been formed and been taking place over decades. All with this, you see the same language being used over and over again. It's all about cooperation, trade liberalisation, consensus. And eventually, as a result of these things, you've seen the situation today, which is an incredibly homogenous culture that's a multinational corporate culture, essentially. Anyway, I'll come on to discussing that in a second. The point is that by 1975 you have this superstructure in place, which I've just been discussing, much of which has been operating for decades. Even something like Bilderberg has been operating for 2 decades by this point in time. The Bretton Woods Agreements, 1944, all of the United Nations and the architecture that was set up just after the Bretton Woods Agreement, that's been operating for 3 decades. And then you've got the formation of the Trilateral Commission. Council on Foreign Relations has been about for 50 years. And then there's finally you have the setting up of the G8, the World Economic Forum, and so on and so forth. Well, the G8 group wasn't set up at that time. But you have all these globalist institutions, and then you have the clandestine and semi-clandestine network of what you could call talking shops, which I refer to as an elite policy network, which encompasses Bilderberg, Trilateral Commission, Council on Foreign Relations. And then you've had this increasing push for trade agreements with the common market having already been operating for 2 decades, the GATT agreement having been in place for nearly 30 years and having been consistently extended by negotiations during this period. At the same time, the Bretton Woods Agreement, which was meant to at least provide some form of currency stability and integrity, has now been scrapped. The US has come off the gold standard, but all of the globalist internationalist system of managing the economic system remains in place. Ostensibly, the dollar remains the world reserve currency, and the world is still run by an Anglo-American political consensus. So that's the situation in 1975. That's 1 year before I was born, when most people would still believe they lived in a system of nation states and they would have no concept of the idea of global governance, let alone that it was actually already in place. It was actually already beginning to take place. It was already beginning to influence their lives. In fact, the consequences of this system are now only beginning to become apparent, although many people still have no understanding of what's going on. This is, of course, because we're still very much told that we live in a world of nation states, and that, when the Olympics comes on the telly, we should all get behind our country, we should all wave our flags, because, we're all British, and Britain still exists as a sovereign nation. It really doesn't in any significant sense. But that's another issue entirely. Just 2 final little things to mention before I end this part, which is that the Federal Reserve had, of course, already been created in 1913. There's a great deal more you could say about that. Obviously, this has been hugely influential in the American system, and continues to have an incredibly detrimental influence on the financial system in the United States to this day, and the level of debt that exists in the United States. You also had the Bank for International Settlements being set up in 1930. This is hugely significant because this is really an organisation that's the apex of the entire world financial system. It's interesting to just briefly look at how the Bank for International Settlements was set up. It was due to an intergovernmental agreement in 1930. This was undertaken by a certain number of founding states, which were Germany, Belgium, France, Britain, Northern Ireland, Italy, Japan and Switzerland. Now, you could really get into discussing the background of this bank because it's quite incredible. Some of the background to it. Just people who are involved on the board in the early stages of it. And some of the history related to it is quite fascinating. But I mean, I won't get into that today. I'll just briefly discuss what the Bank for International Settlements is. It's an international organisation of central banks which fosters international monetary and financial cooperation and serves as a bank for central banks. So, as an international institution, it is not accountable to any single national government. So this was created in 1930. This was already in place long before the time we're talking about, 1975. So this is the situation we have at that time, which was now nearly 40 years ago. But of course, most people were blissfully unaware of what was going on, and it's the creation of this system and the extension of it and the cementing of it and the very central role it's taken in creating the international conditions that exist today, in creating the trading conditions that exist, that have created and led to the situation we see today, and that have led to all kinds of events that would appear to be completely unconnected to it, but in fact this system and this structure is completely central in what is going on. So I'm going to move on to discuss some of that in the next part, but I'm just going to have a brief break, so I will play a song in the meantime, and then I will return in a few minutes. Okay, so by 1975 you have in position this now globalised international monetary system and rules that govern it. You have nothing securitising the major currencies that exist. You have these international globalist organisations that are managing trade and so on and so forth. You have a covert network of what I call a policy group, but it's a series of organisations that elite political, banking and business figures attend, and it would be completely impossible to give an exhaustive record of all the people that have attended the Council of Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission and Bilderberg meetings, because it's thousands of incredibly prominent people. I did write an article for Keelan's site which you can look up. If you just type something like Wide Shut UK 1955 Bilderberg, it should come up, and it gives you an idea of the people attending the 1955 Bilderberg meeting, which were incredibly prominent, even by today's, probably more prominent than the people attended today, because it was less known about, so there was less need for them to hide their attendance. It's just a who's who of the most prominent people in the world at that time, really, or in the North American, European world. And then in addition to that, you've got the creation of these more open organisations that also serve a purpose of either pushing for more globalism, pushing for more interdependence between nations, or managing it. So that's the situation you have in 1975. And what has occurred since then, over the last virtually 4 decades, has been that the consequences of this structure that's been built up have started to play out. And there are many consequences of this on our daily lives and on the way that economies have developed and so on and so forth. But I want to begin by discussing probably the most important. And to precede this, I'm going to play you a clip of Eisenhower speaking in 1961, who will introduce a concept that I'm going to discuss.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. We now stand 10 years past the midpoint of a century that has witnessed 4 major wars among great nations. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
So that was President Eisenhower's farewell address from 1961, in which he spoke of the military-industrial complex. It has been suggested by his relatives that this was something he felt very strongly about, and that he was something of a heroic figure for speaking about it. I'm not sure I would really agree with that. I don't really see him in those terms based on what happened during his presidency, but there was a certain, and the reasons for him speaking about this, I have no idea what they were, but there was a certain honesty to what was being said. And of course, the concept of the military-industrial complex is a pretty well established one now. In fact, if you look up, on any given day, if you go into Google News and just type military-industrial complex, you will see hundreds of articles making reference to it. Now, I think that it's more appropriate to talk about a banking military-industrial complex, because the banking industry is central to the whole operation that the military-industrial complex is involved in, because they invest in the arms manufacturers and corporations, they lend money to the same people, they bankroll the wars that the governments authorise, and the international banks and financial institutions that I was discussing earlier, such as the IMF, are used to funnel money when this structure is taking over the resources and infrastructure of developing or third world countries, which has happened throughout the 21st century in particular. And talking about roads earlier, happened during the British Empire as well, of course. Another important institution that I didn't discuss in the first part was the World Bank. This is also strongly involved in the takeover of resources, often used to funnel money as well. Just to briefly read you the Wikipedia thing about the World Bank. The World Bank's an international financial institution that provides loans to developing countries for capital programs. So, they're making it sound like it has some sort of altruistic means, but in reality, of course, it completely bankrupts and crushes these nations. The World Bank official goal is the reduction of poverty. According to the World Bank's Article of Agreement, all of its decisions must be guided by a commitment to promote foreign investment, international trade, and facilitate capital investment. That's its real aim. Its official goal is the reduction of poverty, but its decisions must be guided by a commitment to promote foreign investment, international trade, and facilitate capital investment. How those two things can be consistent with each other, I have no idea. But there you go. And this is another significant institution that was also created, one of the institutions created the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. So the banking system is absolutely central to what takes place, because they lend all the money, and I'm not going to go into all the ridiculous ways in which money is created and all the debt that it creates. So I assume firstly that most people are fairly aware of this. The Federal Reserve centralized process in the United States that I mentioned earlier. And secondly, I'm aware this is a fairly long programme already, so I don't want to make it any longer than it is already. but Money is Debt is a film that's about this. The Money Masters is another film about this. Creature from Jekyll Island discusses this. There's no end of information about it on Investopedia. I've discussed it in my book. There's many other books written about it that discuss it. So if you want to know more about it, you can look it up in any of those sources. And then you have the because of the escalating debt that has been taking place because of this process, it's become increasingly incumbent upon nations to seek resources on the Anglo-American system to seek resources, and they've done this through military power. If you look at and there's an absolutely huge record of both Britain and America. There was recently an article that was printed, I think it was in the Daily Telegraph, that said that Britain has invaded 90% of the countries in the world. Obviously over a very long time period, but it's thought to be more than any other nation in history. And in America's record of overseas aggression during the period since the Second World War is pretty terrible and pretty all-encompassing. And to this day they have military bases in 130 nations, while people are bordering on starvation in their own country. And they have cut military spending to a certain extent, but they've still signed off $1 trillion defence budget in the past, which is almost exactly equal to their budget deficit. Well, it's not quite equal to, because I think it's about 1.3 trillion. So the military element of the banking military industrial complex is important because arms contractors provide the weaponry that's utilised in all these wars, and it's become particularly powerful because arms contractors, their only customers are governments. So unlike other corporations, they don't try to sell to the public, they don't engage with the public, they don't really require anything from the public other than, they don't want 75% of the public protesting against them. As long as there's just a small modicum of protest and most people just ignore them, they're not really bothered what happens. You can have a negative opinion of them, they don't really care because they don't sell you anything, so it makes no difference to them really. Obviously they engage in PR like any other corporation, but in practical terms they don't really need your acquiescence. They just, as long as you don't really get in their way. And then the industrial element are multinational corporations who invest in the arms industry and benefit from the acquisition of valuable resources via either wars or coups or takeover of infrastructure in these nations. Typically valuable resources are mineral resources, oil, sometimes gold and silver, just commodities. Sometimes it can even be just land and farming equipment. The Operation PB success in Guatemala was all related to land and the trade of bananas. It was involved. The United Fruit Company were involved in that. It was a land grab for them. Essentially, they're now called Chiquita. You'll see I assume the world's biggest banana company. They certainly were a few years ago. I don't know if they have any other interests, but you will see Chiquita written on bananas if you go into any supermarket. But they were involved in military action in Guatemala, where they requested and were involved in negotiations with the US government to run a coup in Guatemala to overthrow the government because they wanted to repatriate their own land. But I'll go on to discussing coups in a second. But finally, governments have a dual role really in this process, which is they create the legislative conditions in which these three powerful elements can prosper, and secondly, they tend to have foreign policy aims that can be met by warfare, so they're constantly feeding this structure that exists. And the whole structure becomes independent as well, because banks invest in the arms industry, and banks lend money to corporations, corporations invest in the arms industry. Corporations require resources to remain profitable, so they need the arms and industry to flourish. Banks wish for corporations' arms contractors to remain profitable as they're invested in them, and for governments to keep going to war so they can lend them more money to do so, and so on. So you have clear vested interest for this banking military industrial complex to continually put pressure on powerful governments to have an aggressive interventionist foreign policy, because they all benefit. And powerful governments have a tendency to be receptive to this pressure, because the more influence they wield in the world, the greater the power they have. So this structure has very much come into being. The power of it has very much increased because of all these groups and all these measures that have made us ever more interdependent There's we hear people talk about the world economy all the time, where it's an ever more globalised world, it's an ever more interdependent world. The concept of a country simply producing what it requires and remaining within its own, retaining its independence, is now a very foreign concept, because obviously trade took place before the Second World War, and there's nothing in principle wrong with a certain amount of international trade, but it's just the fact that every single nation is, or certainly every single Western nation, is hugely reliant on importation, and its production is almost, in terms of, if you look at Britain, for example, virtually, obviously manufacturing is virtually zero. We have a huge importation of basic things like food. Import 50% of our food and 95% of our fruit. So obviously we're hugely reliant on being able to do that. We're hugely reliant on being able to get hold of oil, for example. This is another interesting element of, the oil wars that have taken place. I would assume that even if you wanted to put some people want to put the positive spin on it of saying that, the only reason we're invading those countries is so we can get their oil. But in fact, Britain gets about 3/4 of its oil from Norway. Now, you may be aware that Britain has yet to bomb Norway. So when we've been engaging in Iraq and possibly in the future in Iran and many other oil-rich nations that we've interfered with over the years, it's not even, you can't even be justified on the level of saying that, we got some oil out of it so people could drive their cars and so forth. In fact, we import most of our oil from a European nation that we've never been, they probably are one of the 90% countries that we've invaded, but not recently. So it's just purely something that benefits corporations. It's purely something that benefits this huge circuit of powerful interests I've just discussed, and this is what you see happening again and again, particularly because of the conditions that have been created with the removal of all protectionist measures, with the steady but persistent battering down of tariffs and trade regulations. You see that a few multinational corporations now dominate virtually every important industry, and even lots of unimportant industries. And what you have, and this has created a situation where, because the financial sector is constantly investing in all these things, and because the financial sector has been completely deregulated as well, it's now become hugely powerful. With the financial sector alone is 31% of the gross domestic product in the United States, and it's 15% of the gross domestic product in the UK. So in America it's nearly a third of all economic activity that takes place, and in Britain it's nearly 1/6 of all economic activity that takes place. So at a certain point in time, even if the government had benevolent aims, which usually you wouldn't exactly describe the British government as being consistent with that, at a certain point it becomes very difficult for them to even oppose this system, because obviously 15% of GDP goes down the toilet, or even a significant portion of that 15% of GDP, there's going to be an absolutely gut-wrenching depression, and they're going to have to explain to people why there's been an absolutely gut-wrenching depression. And because they spend all the time telling people a load of nonsense to try and distract people from what's really going on, and distract people from where the real power lies, they can't really just, they couldn't even convey it in a type of language that most people would understand anyway, but they can't really come on TV and let the cat out of the bag and say, we've been saying all this time that the government is where the power really lies. Well, actually, we don't have that much power. We're just really serving this hugely powerful banking, military, industrial complex system that can bankrupt us on any given day. They can literally just pull the carpet from under us at any moment, much like they did when Black Wednesday happened, which I think was in 1991. Might have been in 1991. I'll have to look that up. But this was when Britain had to withdraw from the exchange rate mechanism. It was literally bankrupt in a day. George Soros, who's a famous globalist, and he goes to the meetings at Davos and stuff like that. He made £1 billion. I think it was either £1 billion or $1 billion, because he knew it was going to happen. It was 1992, Black Wednesday, 16th September 1992. So the political system is not, and politicians and people like David Cameron, who pretends like he's running the country, which he isn't. He's hardly going to come on TV and say, oh, by the way, we've decided to really crack down on the financial sector now. Unfortunately, this means that you're all going to be really poor for quite a long time, unless we write off the debt, but there are going to be severe consequences. He's not going to do that. He's going to carry on saying, oh, we're looking for growth. If we just create 1% growth in this quarter, everything's, oh, look, because of the Olympics, we've created 1% growth. We're back on track. That's it. The recession's over now. All the debt that's been created, all of our reliance on this crony capitalist system, don't worry about any of that, because we've created 1% growth. It's not even enough to cover a tiny portion of interest on the debt that we owe, let alone actually paying it back. In fact, it's not even enough to create. It's merely enough to create a small down payment on the deficit that exists, the budget deficit, which is increasing the existing debt every year. But that's the end of the recession. So what you're seeing at the moment is in the United States, they're continually raising their debt ceiling. They're now, I think the current debt ceiling is $16.3 trillion, although I think the agreement that Obama signed gave them some sort of provision to increase it again, possibly. I'm not sure. I'd have to look that up. But it'd be interesting to see. I mean, clearly this hasn't been something that's been discussed in the US presidential elections. They've been discussing Big Bird and whether or not Obama. Was that issue about Romney went on a holiday somewhere and he tied his dog to the top of his car? Did you see that one? So I'm glad they discussed that. That was good. But they didn't actually discuss the fact that the United States is basically broke. So I've got an article here that hopefully will load up. This is in the Kitsap Peninsula Business Journal. I'm sure it's a fine publication. Treasury says debt limit will be hit by late 2012. US Treasury officials said Wednesday that they still expect the government will hit. They expect, of course, it's going to hit it. Will hit the current debt borrowing limit at the end of this year. But they say they can employ extraordinary measures that have been used in the past to keep the government functioning until some. Bear in mind what is being said here. They just say really can't. Yeah, we just need to take some extraordinary measures just to keep the government functioning. So it's just they are just completely broke. They can't. If this was explained in simple household terms, that if you were in a household and you were, say, instead of $16 trillion in debt, let's say you had £16,000 worth of debt that you needed to repay, and every single month you were spending more money than you were getting in, and you had no plan whatsoever to ever stop doing that, and you had no plans whatsoever to ever stop borrowing money to service the fact that you were spending more than you were getting in, right? Would you recover economically from that? No, you wouldn't. You would never recover. Obviously, anyone could say that. Anyone can understand that in the terms of a mortgage or in terms of a personal loan. It's completely obvious that you're completely screwed under those circumstances unless you manage somehow to balance your books. It used to be called a balance of payments on a governmental level. So it says here, Treasury Assistant Secretary Matthew Rutherford said that Treasury would employ the same types of procedures it used previously to keep borrowing under the current debt limit of $16.39 trillion until Congress votes to increase the debt ceiling. So they're just going to increase the debt ceiling again after the election, which they'll have to do because what will happen is the high-ranking politicians and the equivalent of the party whips in the United States will just go around all the Congress and all the Senate saying, if you don't do this, we're broke. We can't pay Social Security. We can't pay food stamps to people. 50 million Americans on food stamps. We can't feed any of those people anymore. We can't continue to fund Medicare. We can't continue to fund Medicaid. We can't continue to fund anything related to the federal government because the federal government is broke. You're all finished. Every single person you represent will hate you. They'll probably be outside your house with a burning torch looking to fork you to death. That was fork, by the way. Your careers are finished. You can forget about your salary. There won't be anything to pay it with. You'd be lucky to be alive, if anything. The best thing you probably do is try and get into Mexico. So they're obviously going to be very, very receptive to the arguments that they should raise the debt ceiling again, which is what will happen. So all that's happening at the moment is the debt ceiling is being raised continually. It's just so that this whole ridiculous enterprise of going into countries to steal their resources, to try to keep things afloat just about can continue, and I think it will now continue. I thought, well, you have to be wary about making this prediction, because I've heard people who know a great deal more than me, who are absolute experts on economics, say that a crash is coming very, very soon, and that's certainly possible. But I don't think you'll see a crash until, at the very least, there's been some sort of engagement with Iran, because acquiring oil is one of the most important aspects of the system, because the oil companies have become so powerful. Outside of the banking industry, they're probably the most powerful corporations. They always figure incredibly prominently in the list of the top 2,000 corporations each year that's released by Forbes. So they have taken on a particularly prominent role, and I think that I know that one of the things that's taking place at the moment is that every last possible source of new oil that can be found is trying to be exploited. This is why you're seeing in Venezuela Hugo Chavez, who's not a bad guy at all, who's done good things for his country, is being completely demonised by the United States. That's simply because Venezuela is reckoned to have it's not a precise and exact science, so I don't think you can say this with certainty, but you can certainly, Venezuela is presumed to have the world's largest oil reserves, and you can certainly say they have very, very large oil reserves. But they haven't, because the infrastructure in Venezuela doesn't exist in a way that it does in some of the world's biggest oil producing nations. They haven't really tapped that source in the way that they might have done, particularly if they're a Western nation. So they're not in the top 10 nations of oil producers, but they've got this huge reserve. So, I mean, the US would love to just go in there and start bombing them tomorrow. But, I mean, they obviously can't. They can't. I think when Chavez has sought an alliance with Russia and China, but I'll be discussing that more next week. But at present, they can't do anything about Venezuela, but they're trying to do something about Iran. We're seeing the same conflict with Russia and China, reluctant to sign these UN resolutions and so forth, and the United States trying to demonise them as if they're the same thing with Syria, which was Iran's major ally. So, I mean, the reason they're interested in Syria and the reason they're interested in Iran is just, I mean, you could put forward deeper reasons, but just on a basic level, they're simply trying to acquire the resources to keep their stupid economic system going, because they can't possibly service it any other way. I mean, the American government is admitting that the Treasury Secretary is saying we're finished. The government is literally just going to break down in like about a month if we don't raise the debt ceiling, and as much as they try to keep it going, as much as David Cameron comes on TV, Britain's in exactly the same situation. Britain's in a worse financial situation than the United States. As much as he comes on TV and says, "Oh, we've created 1% of growth. Well done, everyone. Good job you brought all those flags during the Olympics." As much as he does that, it's not going to make any difference to anything. And it's because you've reached the point of debt saturation where there is no way you can conceive. There's only two conceivable things you can do. You either default on the debt and fail to pay it back, or you can inflate the currency, either steadily through inflation or eventually through crippling inflation. It'll probably be the latter. Most people that are savvy on this subject are predicting the latter will occur. I don't know if that's the case or not, but it's certainly one possible situation. But another consequence of this is that corporations, banks and the central banks and the banking structure are absolutely huge, but the sort of multinational corporations, these oil companies and various other corporations, the big corporations, financial services, banks, insurance, the oil industry, and to a certain extent the motor industry, because they obviously benefit hugely from the oil industry. They tend to be the biggest corporations. What happens is because of the extent to which these corporations are able to now go into every nation, so you see the same corporations dominating industry in country after country all over the world. But I mean, certainly in Europe, if you go abroad, if you went to, say, Germany on a holiday, you'll see so many companies and adverts for things that you recognise, which wouldn't have been the case at one time. But I mean, you can go obviously much further afield than that and see the same thing. And so corporations become absolutely huge. So by the year 2000, there was a study done that showed that there were 51 corporations in the top 100 financial entities in the world. Now you may say, what's the big deal about that? Well, those financial entities include countries. So corporations actually outnumbered countries in the world's top 100 financial entities. And there was a second study done some years later, and by this time, I think this was in 2010, there were 114 corporations in the top 200 financial entities in the world. So it's now 57% of that list. It's just companies, not nations. Nations make up 43% of the list now. So if you can imagine the pressure one massive multinational corporation can put on one government, imagine a raft of them acting together, putting pressure on a small government. And there's no way they can stand up to it. It's certainly very difficult to stand up to it. And this is something that is discussed extensively in Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which is a book by John Perkins, which explains the extent to which this process has taken place, and the infrastructure of developing nations and what are referred to as third world nations has slowly been taken over by this corporate-fascist system, this crony capitalist system. So there are all kinds of unintended consequences of this, but one unintended consequence is that it is something that I thought of a quite odd way of illustrating this, but I think it's quite an interesting way of showing it. I looked up the video for the 1974 FA Cup final. Now, you may very well wonder, why on earth did you do that? Which would be a reasonable question. What I did was I looked at the advertising hoardings that were around the side of the pitch for the 1974 FA Cup final. You can look this up yourself on YouTube. So I just want to discuss some of these advertising hoardings and what happened to them. So one of them was Esso, this is just a trade name for ExxonMobil, who were the fourth largest corporation in the world. The oil industry was already massive by 1974 and was already completely multinational. The second advertising hoarding was for something called Yorkie, which was a chocolate bar. Do you still get Yorkie bars? I never really rated them as a chocolate bar. I don't know why. I love chocolate, but that was never one of my favourites. Anyway, this used to be produced by a company called Rowntree's. Younger listeners will never have heard of Rowntree's, and there's a reason for that. It's because Nestle took them over in the 80s. I very well remember this happening. I think Rowntree's was a Sheffield company. Anyway, Nestle just came along and said, we'll give you millions of dollars, we'll just take over production. And they said, okay, that's fine. So Yorkie bars, Rowntree's the company that produced Yorkie bars that was being advertised at the cup final. They're just consumed by Nestle. Nestle, the world's 26th biggest corporation, according to Forbes. Then there was an advertising hoarding for Vision Hire. This was a part of a group called Granada. There was a British television company. They're just finished. They cease to exist. I assume they can't compete with huge multinational television companies. Then there was an advertising hoarding for Norwich Union. They were taken over by Aviva in 2009. Aviva is the world's sixth largest insurance company. It's the 135th biggest corporation in the world overall. So that's another British company just gone, subsumed into Aviva. And then there was there's an advertising hoarding for the Midland Bank. Again, younger people won't remember the Midland Bank at all, but they used to call themselves the Listening Bank back in the day. That was their advertising slogan. Unfortunately, HSBC came along in 1992 with an offer of £3.9 billion to take over the Midland Bank, and they listened to that very carefully indeed. And indeed, they were then subsumed into the HSBC, which is the world's second largest corporation, absolutely huge banking corporation. And then there were advertising hoardings for Ford and Hitachi. Hitachi, obviously multinational producer of electronics. It's in the top 500 corporations in the world, and Ford, absolutely massive motor company, because oil had already established itself as a huge multinational concern by this date. They're able to advertise the cup final. They've already completely penetrated the British market. So if you were to show that cup final to people, obviously it was beamed all over the world in 1974. If you're in Argentina watching the English FA Cup final, you see Norwich, you probably first of all wouldn't know how to pronounce Norwich, but if you see an advertising hoardings for Norwich Union and Vision Hire, you will have absolutely no idea who they are. You probably won't know what a Yorkie bar is. You won't have heard of the Midland Bank. Now, if you compare that to today, the Champions League is sponsored by the following companies. It's sponsored by Ford. Obviously, everyone knows who Ford are. Sponsored by Heineken. It's a multinational brewer. It's the third largest brewer in the world. 413th largest corporation. You'll see that. Obviously, everyone knows who Heineken are. There's MasterCard, which is the world's second biggest credit card company. Obviously, they're in every country in the world. Sony, obviously, everyone knows who Sony is. They're the 456th largest corporation in the world. Huge consumer electronics producer. The only one people might not have heard of is UniCredit. They're the 74th largest corporation in the world. They're an Italian corporation that was created by the merger of several banks. So when the Champions League gets beamed around the world in the year 2012, and people see these companies, and there have been other Champions League sponsors like McDonald's and so forth, everyone knows who they are. It doesn't matter if you're in Argentina, it doesn't matter if you're in the United States, it doesn't matter if you're in China, it doesn't matter if you're in France. Everyone knows who Sony are, everyone knows who Heineken are, because these companies are all active in all of these countries. And this is a consequence of what I was discussing some time ago, which was just the eradication of any protectionist measures to favour a nation's individual companies and individual products. This hasn't happened by accident. It's not a coincidence that when you walk down the high street of any town in the country, you see, oh, there's Sainsbury's, there's a Tesco, there's a Carphone Warehouse, there's a Starbucks, there's a McDonald's, there's a Burger King, oh, there's another Tesco's. That's not a coincidence. It's because a very fertile environment has been created for these multinational corporations, and they've become behemoths in size over this period of time, over these decades that have taken place since this international globalist system was put in place. That wasn't the reason the system was put in place. The reason was to really help the banking hierarchy and the corporations that immediately benefit from it. This is really an unintended consequence. You know, this system wasn't put in place so that Subway could have shops in every town in Britain, and that Starbucks could have shops in every town in Britain. That's just something that's occurred because other sandwich stores can't really... I mean, that's probably one area where there are still a few independent shops. You probably still do see in a big city where I used to live, you used to see a few independent shops, and I always used to make sure I went into those shops. But nevertheless, everyone's aware of Subway. You know, everyone's aware of McDonald's and Burger King and Kentucky Fried Chicken and all these other huge either fast food or restaurant chains, and they've hugely benefited from the sort of protectionism that's taken place. Had it not taken place, I'm sure they would still have some form of presence in Britain, because they're always looking to expand. And this was if you read the book Fast Food Nation, this was a strategy of McDonald's going back for quite a long period of time. But it would have been much harder for them to establish themselves to the extent that they have, and it would be much easier for smaller businesses to compete with them. Of course, people have to take some responsibility for this, because it is at least partly occurred because consumers haven't made ethical and responsible choices. So, there's just one last thing that I really want to discuss, which is a very important date, and the date is the 13th of August 1953. This date was particularly important because this was the date on which Operation Ajax began. Operation Ajax was the overthrow of the Mossadegh government in Iran, which was a joint MI6 and CIA operation. It was actually instigated by Churchill, who in 1951 approached the United States to attempt to overthrow Mossadegh. This was a democratically elected leader of Iran who was very popular. And the only reason Churchill wanted to overthrow him was because he wanted to nationalise the oil supply of Iran. At the time, the oil interests of Iran were controlled by the Anglo-American oil company, which later became British Petroleum. And Churchill wasn't overly happy about the idea of Iran's oil supply being nationalised. Of course, this is why Britain and America have been so involved in the in the internal politics of Iran throughout the decades that have followed. If it was just a dusty country in the middle of nowhere with no oil supply and with no resource value to the corporations that ultimately drive public policy, then you would never have heard anything about it on the news, just like you haven't about any other number of remote countries that have no interest or relevance to Britain or America whatsoever, except in the fact that they have oil. So initially Truman, who was the President of the United States in 1951, was against this plan. I assume he was merely against it because he thought it might backfire in public relations terms. I doubt he had any moral objection to it. But Eisenhower agreed to it in 1953. This is why I'm not particularly of the opinion that Eisenhower was some fantastic human being who was driven by morality. I find that very difficult to believe. But anyway, he did do that military-industrial complex speech, so at least he did something useful. And this was the first. This obviously routinely happens all the time now, but 15th of August 1953 was the first time the CIA threw out a government through covert and overt action. You can read a great deal of background about this, but there are YouTube videos that deal with the background quite well in quite a succinct way. But needless to say, a lot of people were slaughtered. Mossadegh was held under house arrest, died in house arrest, I think 2 years later. And this was only 2 years after he'd been named as Time Man of the Year. He was Time Man of the Year, Time Magazine Man of the Year in 1951. Ironically, the year that Churchill began thinking about throwing him out. And of course, the reason this has happened was just purely because it serves corporate interests. As I discussed previously, I'm not sure what percentage of oil Britain derived from Iran at that time, but it wouldn't have been a huge percentage, and the main interest was really the interest of the Anglo-American oil company. It was really a financial, economic and resource interest, not a supply issue. But this was the first time the CIA threw out a foreign government, and of course, since then, it could have worked out very differently. I mean, had it not been as successful, Operation Ajax not been as successful as it was, perhaps history would have taken a different course. Unfortunately, it was very successful, and they almost instantly began Operation PB Success in Guatemala. And this policy of throwing out governments with covert and overt military action and intelligence agency behaviour, and also running operations within the country, propaganda operations, often funding opposition, all kinds of various activity that the United States and Britain, to a lesser extent, has been involved in, has dominated the latter half of the 21st century. And all foreign policy, certainly all the United States foreign policy, and you could see exactly the same pattern with Britain, who have always supported the United States, even when in the United Nations every other country has been against them. Britain has always supported them. And this has been about geopolitics and, more specifically, the domination of resources to feed the economic system that I've been discussing. And eventually all areas of public policy are hijacked to serve this system. And a good example of this is Afghanistan, where you had Operation Cyclone, which was the military intelligence operation to radicalise, fund and arm the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. I think this began when the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was taking place. Then, of course, you had, everyone knows about 9/11, there was a period of civil war with the Taliban, and then eventually the US decided that they would invade Afghanistan because, the dirty Muslims brought the towers down. They obviously had then invaded Afghanistan to fight the government that they'd radicalised and funded. Once they got into Afghanistan, they greatly incentivised the Afghani farmers to produce more opium. Opium production had almost dried up completely under the Taliban. As soon as the US got in there, it went through the roof again. This was exactly what happened in Central and Latin America with cocaine in places like Bolivia. Once they've done that, they run the drugs into the United States, and then they say, oh, there's loads of drugs in the United States, we need to have a war on drugs. They then bust the people for the drugs that they've run into the country, and this feeds the prison system. Of course, they've privatised the prison system so that corporations run the prison system and get paid per prisoner. So poor people can then be used to make money for corporations. This is the primary reason that the prison system is privatised. It's because there's a raft of people at the bottom of society that are on welfare, on food stamps, on benefit in Britain, and they're not profitable. So this is simply a good way of profiting off those people. Once they get into prison, corporations then use these prisoners as slave labour. This is already happening in Britain, but it's a massive program in the United States, and they had things like during this is depicted in the film The Shawshank Redemption, where they had projects where prisoners would work on various projects outside of the prison, stuff like cleaning up areas, various simple building projects and so forth. And of course, while they're in prison, being used as slave labour, being locked up for using the drugs that were run into the country by the people who radicalised the Muslims so they could invade them, so they could increase opium production, so they could run the drugs into the country. The war on drugs is used as rhetoric, and so is the war on terror, to ramp up the police state, which results in more privatisation and corporatisation of this sector of the economy. And it results in more arrests, which builds a bigger private prison system, so you have to build more prisons, which is good for the corporate sector. You need more people to fill those prisons, so you need a bigger war on drugs, so you need mud, and so on. So this is just one example of how this economic system becomes just an absolute parasite that controls every area of public policy, or every significant area of public policy. And at the same time, because of the vast amounts of debt, you see every area. This has hugely been the case in Britain with private finance initiatives, which people don't realise in Britain we don't even own our own infrastructure. It's all been built by public sector corporations on the tick, essentially, and now we've got to pay them all back. We can't pay them back because we're already in massive amounts of debt. So I don't know how that will play out, but you're going to see more privatisation of the NHS and more privatisation of basic services. So what you're seeing now in Europe, all over Europe, quote-unquote austerity, this is merely what has been played out in Africa, Latin America and the Middle East for decades. It's just been plundered by this crony capitalist, fascist, globalist, international banking and financial and corporate system, so that multinational corporations can take over, even more than they have already. This is described extensively in the book I mentioned earlier, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. There's two differences in Europe. We haven't seen the extreme and abject poverty of Africa yet, although, as I say, there's 50 million Americans on food stamps. There are a hell of a lot of people in this country that are reliant on benefit and so forth. So we're a lot more vulnerable than we think we are. And secondly, there's no need to overthrow or assassinate any of our political leaders, because they all just go along with it. So, there's been lots of incidents of governments being overthrown, people being assassinated and so forth. Doesn't happen in Britain because David Cameron will just do exactly what he's required to do, because he went through all the conditioning system of the public schools and the private schools and Eton and Cambridge and the debate clubs and so on and so forth. So by the time his sorry arse ends up in the Conservative Party, and he's working as a researcher, he will already know, given his background, that he's going to end up as a very significant position in the Conservative Party, and he's fully trained to behave exactly as he's required to behave. So the result of all this behaviour is, as I'd already described, that there's an incredibly fertile environment for these banking and corporate interests, and the environment becomes increasingly hostile for what I call sovereign entities, whether these are individual or national. And the writer and researcher and journalist Daniel Estulin, he was talking about the Bilderberg meeting when he said this, but he could very much have been describing the prevailing economic system and the prevailing mentality that has driven this economic system. It's a meeting of, he said the following, it's a meeting of people that represent a particular ideology. That ideology is of money. So the idea is not to create one world government, but rather the creation of one world company limited, where the financial concerns are far more powerful than any government on earth. And actually we see in Europe as evidence, where we have nation states, we have countries with their own constitutions, our own flags, our own currencies, our own monetary policies. Now we don't have any of that. The entirety of Europe is being led and directed through Brussels in that sense. Spain, where I live, had a currency, we lost it. We had a constitution that is now subordinate to the European constitution. The Spanish flag is no longer ours, it's now the European flag with little stars. And of course the monetary policy is decided somewhere else. We can see what they're doing, and Greece is a very good example of that structure we are witnessing, and Spain of course is going to be the next country to go. So what you have today is absolute corporate fascism, and when you make statements like, Britain is already a fascist country, that is obviously something that people don't respond to very favourably. But Mussolini who was a fascist, you might be aware, stated fascism should more appropriately be called corporatism because it is a merger of state and corporate power. So when we talk about fascism, we tend to think about the Nazis marching through the streets and all of the stuff that they were involved in. This is typically how British people view fascism. And of course that is one type of fascism. But the fascism we see today, and it was something that was discussed very openly by Benito Mussolini, was this merger of state and corporate power. This is what you have today without a shadow of a doubt. But bear in mind, Mussolini's talking about one country. He's talking about the architecture of one country being deliberately pushed in that direction by a fascist party. What you have today is this taking place over dozens of countries, over hundreds of countries, and of all those countries being interdependent and linked together by this system that they've been conniving for decades. So if you're talking about a new world order, which is the phrase that's often used to describe this, I would define this as the point at which no sovereign entity, whether individual, regional or national, can assert any form of independence over this system of multinational or global corporate banking fascism. So you don't need to worry yourselves with when this is coming, because it's already here now. It's just a case of how far we go into the system before people realise how rotten it is. Thankfully, many people are already beginning to understand this, and I do see some positive signs. So, to be part of this is hopefully making a small contribution to more people becoming aware of what's going on. But what these interests are really looking to achieve is a global plantation economy. I would call it a neo-feudal state, a neo-feudal society, where a handful of interests control all the major industries and resources, and you either work for them, buy from them, or pay tax to them, ideally all three. This brings me on to the final point, which I'd like to discuss, which is related to an organisation I mentioned earlier, which is the Bank for International Settlements. Ultimately, everything we're discussing here, all economic activity is filtered into this bank. This is all economic activity anywhere in the world. There may be a tiny number of countries that manage to escape this system. If they can't be taken over by covert economic and or intelligence agency operations, then they'll end up with napalm, cluster bombs, depleted uranium, atomic bombs. All the military might that's been built up by this military-industrial complex will be dropped on their heads until they say, OK, we surrender. So I've already spoken about this on Keelan's show, but I'm going to go over this information again because it is very important. If you go to the shop now, when you buy a chocolate bar, there'll be 20% VAT on it. That 20% VAT goes straight to the Chancellor, to the Exchequer, which is overseen by the Chancellor of the Exchequer. The Exchequer manages the finances for the UK. Gordon Osborne, George Osborne, even though he has no maths or economics qualifications whatsoever, will obviously know that Britain is flat broke and can never ever repay its debts, and all this money is owed to overseas private banks who borrow their money from central banks, who are themselves private corporations or privately owned, and it's ultimately filtered into the Bank for International Settlements, which is the central bank of central banks. On their own website they say, let me just find this quotation. The mission of the Bank for International Settlements is to serve central banks in their pursuit of monetary and financial stability, to foster international cooperation in those areas, and to act as a bank for central banks. However, this is a privately owned bank, however, the New York Federal Reserve has noted that currently 86% of the shares of the Bank for International Settlements are registered in the name of central banks, and 14% are held by private shareholders. So the institution which is regulating and overseeing the activity of central banks and this crony capitalist system that I've been describing is 86% owned by the people that it's overseeing and regulating. So ultimately all economic activity is filtered into this bank by hook or by crook, whether you're talking about military industrial spending, whether you're talking about just everyday transactions, whether you're talking about PAYE tax system, whether you're talking about council tax, anything ultimately is filtered into this bank because everything goes to the Exchequer, and the Exchequer knows very well that it's all going into these private overseas banks. If you go back and look at a book written by a person I mentioned earlier, Carol Quigley, Tragedy and Hope, he says the following in this book, and this is a big establishment and elite insider. The power of financial capitalism had a far-reaching plan, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. The system was to be controlled in a feudalistic fashion by the central banks of the world acting in concert by secret agreements arrived at in frequent meetings and conferences. The apex of the system was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. Each central bank sought to dominate its government by its ability to control treasury loans, to manipulate foreign exchanges, to influence the level of economic activity in the country, and to influence cooperative politicians by subsequent rewards in the business world. And that's the wet dream of these psychopathic crony capitalists, to just be able to filter all economic activity in the world, ideally create a digital currency to make it even easier, into this one, so there's no black market, there's no cash in hand, there's no I'll just, do a job for you on your car and you can pay me cash in hand and I'll just hold it and I won't pay tax on it. And no more of that. Just everything is digitalised, so every single transaction can be traced. And obviously the plan is to pay it all into this one private bank that regulates the other private banks that own the regulator. So you have this incredibly powerful, already hugely integrated structure where everything is ultimately being fed into the Bank of International Settlements, yet they're the organisation overseeing the regulation of it, and the majority owned by the central banks that they're overseeing. So you've had all these decades of all the things that I've been discussing, all the GATT meetings and agreements, Bilderberg meetings, Council on Foreign Relations policy recommendations, the European Union, European Commission initiatives, United Nations resolutions, World Bank accords, all the bombing of foreign countries, all the intelligence agency operations, all the NATO activity, and all the rest of it, because I could have actually spent a lot longer than this rather lengthy programme discussing all these things, and they've all been working towards this. As James Joyce said, all history moves towards one great goal. And he was nearly correct. Unfortunately, it's one terrible goal. And that's really the structure of the world as I see it in the year 2012, and this has been what the post-Second World War world has been about, and this has been what public and foreign policy has been driven by. And that's all I'm going to say today, because I'm fully aware that this has been quite a long programme as it is, so I'm just going to wrap things up now. One thing I'd like to point out briefly, and I'll try to remember to point this out at the end of every single programme, is that I don't want you to take my word for anything that I've said today. There's no particularly compelling reason that you should believe me. If you don't agree with something I've said, or if you think that something I've said is incorrect, I would challenge you to look it up. Don't take my word for it. Look it up for yourself. Because my aim is to simply provide information that's 100% documented. If there's a subject that's contentious, that where there are grey areas where things can't be documented and things can't be confirmed to a satisfactory degree, then I simply won't talk about it. I'm only going to talk about things that can be documented. So if you disagree with something you've heard today, look it up and see if you think it's accurate. So that's all I have to say today. Next week I'm going to be discussing something else related to this system, because unfortunately it takes time to lay these things out so that they can be understood, so that in a holistic way, so that you can see the full magnitude of what has occurred and the full magnitude of how these things have been built, and the consequences on the way we live our lives today. So next week I'm going to be discussing the significance of China and what are called the BRIC nations, which is Brazil, Russia, India and China, and to a lesser extent South Africa, and why they're important and why they have relevance to what's going on at the moment, because I'm conscious that this would take a significant amount of time, and this program would become far too long. So I hope you found this informative. I haven't got some brilliant spiel to close the programme with, because I'm not an accomplished broadcaster yet, but you can download this programme on YouTube. You can access it by going to flippingthepyramid.co.uk. I believe there's other forms of social media through which you can download the programme. I'm not fully versed with what those are, but I'm sure if you go to Flipping the Pyramid and contact the people who run the site, they will be able to tell you, or you'll be able to find links to it on their site. I'm hopefully going to set up a blog, and so that each week you can look at articles related to what I've been talking about, but I think that's also going to be on the Flipping the Pyramid site. But that's all I have to say today. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you next week.